Hey everybody, this is Tom from VermiBag. I want to do an update on the big feeding I did last week on this VermiBag Max and also on the VermiBag Mammoth. I did put a lot of food scraps into both of these systems. It's the first time I've really done a heavy feeding on these in quite a while. So I want to take a peek into them and just see how the worms are handling all the scraps that I put in. I think there'll probably be quite a bit of food left in these. I don't think the worm population is quite large enough to go through that kind of material just yet, but we'll dig through them a little bit and just see how the worms are doing in them. Let's take a look at the VermiBag Max first. Now, a lot of worms on the surface. One little issue that I've been running into lately is I left some of my moist bedding outside and I didn't have it covered, and I definitely had a lot of small flies. They're like house flies. They're a little bit smaller. I'm not sure exactly what they are, that must have laid eggs inside my bedding, and so then when I put my bedding in the bags, they tend to hatch out. So you need to be careful when you make that bedding up that you make sure you seal it up really well so nothing can get in there and lay eggs and stuff inside of it. Let's go ahead and dig down inside here and see what this looks like. They're definitely working through this material. Actually, there's some pieces of the cantaloupe, just the skin left. Actually, there's really hardly any food there, surprisingly. The other side here. A little bit of an egg carton. But the actual food scraps, I mean, there's a little piece of cantaloupe skin, that's it. And then again, some of the stalks, which definitely take longer to decompose, so it's understandable that they'd be here still. But the worms are everywhere. They're really, really thick. So, there's a little bit more material. Now that's warm. That's real warm. That chunk right there. I can feel the heat coming off of that. But if you notice, it's a big, huge pile of material that hasn't been separated. And there's no worms right in the center, of course. It's definitely too hot for them there. So I'll spread it out a little bit. That's the reason that's there for sure. It's just too warm. The rest of the stuff, I don't feel any heat, but I mean, that's roasty toasty for sure. So that's why they're not into that. A little bit of cardboard. I put down some layers of cardboard. Definitely a little bit warm right here too. Not nearly as warm as that other section. Again, it was an area where I had quite a bit of food piled up. There's some banana peels there. Now this is a little warm, but it's not hot. And you can see the worms are starting to work their way through this area right here. There's a lot of little worms in here. So I think they're ready to come into these areas that are really, really hot, but they're just waiting for the temperature, I think, to come down so they can get into them. So I think I probably should have tried to spread the material out a little bit deeper maybe, or put it in 2 layers. As you see here, I mean, this is definitely ready to decompose, but there's no worms in there at all. It's just way too warm for them. So again, I'll just spread these out a little bit, and they'll definitely get into it very quickly. So the worms have really, they're into these areas where it's not hot. Anywhere where the temperature is acceptable for them, I mean, they're into it in masses. The areas where it's a little bit too hot, you know, they're still waiting for it to cool down a little bit to get into. So overall, I'm pretty impressed. I didn't think actually that they would go through that material as well as they did. But I don't think I'm going to give it any more food right now. There's enough mixed here and there, but definitely by next week. There's no doubt that it'll be ready for a feeding for next week. So pretty impressed. I think they did a good job. Worms look real healthy, and they're working on that material. Broke it up a little bit so it'll be able to cool down a little bit and they'll be able to get into it. So let's take a look at the Mammoth. So open up the right hand side of the Mammoth here first and see what it looks like. And again, the surface is pretty well covered with worms, and a lot of castings on the top. They definitely are working through the system, especially on the surface here. And you can definitely tell where there must be some cantaloupe, or I guess this was the squash. So a lot of these squash sprouts came up. So dig down in here and see what it looks like underneath where all that squash was. Nothing there. A lot of worms. And this is a mixture. This bin has a little of everything in it. I mean, I have African night crawlers, I have Euros in here, and I have red wigglers as well. Actually, I'm kind of surprised. So far I haven't really bumped into any of that squash. I really thought there'd be some of it in here. There's a tiny little piece of some of it, but I mean the worms are everywhere inside this. I mean, these are big chunks. Looking at the video, what it used to look like and what it looks like now, I mean, big difference. Well, I mean, there's nothing. Not what I expected at all. I actually expected there to be actually a fair amount of that squash left, but I mean, I see basically nothing. So let's take a look at the other side and see if it's the same. Open the left-hand side of this Mammoth. Kind of the same on this side. The surface is really well worked over. A lot of worms hanging out. I mean, some of these things are big. You look at the size of that African night crawler from there all the way over there. It's as wide as my hand. Dig down and see if any of this squash is left on this side. Yeah, that's what's left of this squash. I mean, a thin piece of paper. Lots and lots of worms. Wow, they've really worked this over. I'm really impressed. I didn't expect them, because I haven't been feeding these guys aggressively for quite a while. But so just to dump a huge feeding on them like that, for them just to react that quickly, that there's that many worms in here still. I mean, anywhere these squash pieces were, I mean, all that's left is seeds. So, one more here. There's another little piece, but again, it's just skins. I mean, that is paper thin. There's a tiny, that's the biggest chunk I've seen so far. There's a little piece of squash there. It's a little bit warm, not terribly bad. Oh, here's another, oh, well, there's nothing on it. Squash, but it's just the skin of it completely. So yeah, again, very impressive. I didn't think they'd react this quickly, but they did. So this system's ready for another feeding. So I'm going to grab a bag of kitchen scraps, just miscellaneous stuff I have in the freezer, let it thaw out just a little bit and spread it out. I'm going to give them a pretty hefty feeding again. So this is what I'm going to go ahead and put into the VermiBag Mammoth. I weighed both of these. This is 11 pounds of scraps. Then I'm going to add a lot of bedding too, so it'll definitely be over the 20-pound mark, probably about 25 pounds total. But this is just a frozen mass of material. There's a little of everything in here. Cucumbers, tomatoes, limes, oranges, broccoli pieces, you name it. The other side's a little bit more fruit because we made up some smoothies and stuff. So I got a lot of cantaloupe, some broccoli, some little apricots. So I'm going to let that thaw out just a tiny little bit, and once it's thawed out a little bit, I'm going to bust it up and throw a little more bedding in the Mammoth and set this on top and cover it up again with a little bit of bedding. So I'll weigh the total amount, but I would expect it to be, you know, upwards of 20-some pounds total. Again, they did a really good job taking care of the material I gave them last week, so they can definitely handle some more. Okay, here's the scraps, 11 pounds of scraps that I have kind of dispersed on both sides of the bag. I tried to be real careful not to pile anything up on top of each other, try and make it as a real thin layer to avoid things hot composting too much. So all I'm going to do now is add about 10 pounds of bedding on top of this, maybe just a little bit more, and cover it all up. Now notice also that I put a thin layer of paper, shredded paper, at the bottom of this thing. I did that partly because down the bottom here you'll notice I did have a little leachate coming through from that heavy feeding the other day, so I want to try and absorb a little bit of that moisture. And it's understandable, you give that kind of a heavy feeding, you're probably going to get some leachate or something coming through the system. I mean, it's not the end of the world, the system will dry itself out real quickly, but if you do heavy feedings like this, put something underneath it because you'll get a little bit of leachate dripping out probably. Okay, so I ended up adding 16 pounds of bedding onto this to cover all the scraps up. So I have 11 pounds of scraps and 16 pounds of bedding on top of that, so 27-pound feeding for the VermiBag Mammoth. And I mean, they did a really good job for last week. I'm really surprised that they were able to go through all that squash I put in there. So the system ramped up really fast again. I mean, there were a lot of worms in there and they were kind of spread throughout the bag, but I think this will bring all the worms up to the surface really quickly. And I'm just going to continue feeding this thing real heavy and, you know, see if I can get up into the 40-pound area and stuff on feedings on it before I leave on vacation. And like I said, I did get a little bit of leachate. And if you're feeding bags this heavy, you're going to get some leachate coming out of it. So I wouldn't concern yourself about it too much. The system will dry out a little bit pretty quickly if you stop feeding, you know, such wet material into the bag. So that's it. This is Tom from VermiBag. Until next week, ciao.